You're listening to a 58 Ember production.
Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the Completely Fucking Clueless podcast. My name is Sarah Alice Liddy, and I use she, her pronouns. And as you guys can see, you're in my bedroom today. I don't think you've ever seen my bedroom before, but we are doing something a little different. We are doing a virtual recording. Audrey is home because it's currently Mother's Day weekend, and so wanted her to go celebrate with her mom. And I am here with the lovely Gianna. Welcome to the podcast.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. I'm so excited to be on the podcast today.
Of course, we're super excited to have you. And I feel like it's honestly such a great time for you to be here because, getting vulnerable very quickly. I feel like I've been, going through stuff with like vaginal health recently and feeling like, all these like symptoms. I was like, oh my gosh, do I have a UTI? I went to the doctor. She was like, you don't have any yeast, but still like feeling uncomfortable. And something she had recommended was taking like vaginal probiotics and stuff like that. So I'm really excited to chat with you, hear about your journey and get like all of your expertise in this because I think it's such a important topic for women to chat about together.
Absolutely. No, I completely get it. I think that's the beauty of this space, vaginal health in general. And then also like my journey of transitioning from a scientist to an
Yeah.
entrepreneur and being able
Mm-hmm.
to navigate that all while thinking of my customers, falling in love with my customers and being able to educate them and also create products for that need. It's just been like a lot, but I'm an open book. I love getting vulnerable about my journey and about everything vaginal health. So I'm so excited to chat about it.
Yay. So let's hop right into it. So, something that you've put out on your social media and have talked about is like your journey getting into like studying the vaginal microbiome is because you were experiencing a lot of vaginal health problems. So, can you tell us about like what that journey was like for you?
Yeah. Yeah. So I feel like the average girl, like every girl, I didn't really know much about my vagina. And what I did know about my vagina was pretty much the stereotypes of the vagina. And so I didn't really know much. And I remember when I was having my very first urinary tract infection, I was actually on my period the same time that I was having the UTI. And so when that burning sensation kicked in, I really just attributed it to my period. I was like, oh,
Yeah.
like what is this feeling? Like a UTI didn't cross my mind. I had never had one before. I didn't fully understand. I had just heard of UTIs. And so I didn't think I was having one and I ignored it, but I was like extremely uncomfortable. And so I actually sat with my UTI for a whole week because I didn't understand what was going on. And it wasn't until I was hospitalized. I was in college at the time. So I was a sophomore at college studying biomedical engineering. And so I was like, this just doesn't feel right. I started to have a fever a week later. My roommate actually called the ambulance and I was rushed to the hospital and they were like, you have a UTI. Because I mean, I was ironically also having some kind of cold. So I was like, maybe the fever is attributed to like my cold. Well, they asked me in the hospital, like, are you having any pain while peeing or any burning while peeing? And I was like, yes, I'm having burning. And they're like, let's just take a urine sample. They ran a CAT scan and they're like, sweetie, you have a UTI. And if you waited any longer, you could have sepsis and you could die. So we need to treat you immediately. So they put me on a very strong dose of antibiotics. But unfortunately, after that very first UTI, I got one. And then after that, I just kept getting them. Like it was a never ending cycle. Never in my life could I have predicted that I would be in this like recurring state. And it's frustrating because you go to the doctor and they're just like, oh yeah, once you get one, you get like a million of them. And it's like nobody ever explains to you why. It's just the norm. And this is part of like those stereotypes. And like I've even had a doctor tell me, you'll grow out of it. Like it's so unbelievable. I'm like, what do you mean I'll grow out of it? And so that is like what prompted me. Even at this point, I was having UTI after UTI after UTI. And I come from an ethnic home. I'm a first generation Syrian American. And so like the vagina is not well studied within the Arab community or like well understood or well talked about. And so even with my mom, my mom has always been very open and honest with me, and I feel very comfortable with my mom. But even then, I mean, she's not a vaginal expert. She knows
Right.
about the vagina, what she's kind of grown up being told. And so I remember when I was saying I had burning, she was like, yeah, it's probably your period. And we just both attributed it to my period. And so I just kept getting UTI after UTI after UTI. And it was ridiculous at that point. I started forming antibiotic resistance to multiple antibiotics. So at this point, there's 3 different antibiotics that I cannot take for my urinary tract infections because I am resistant. But even after becoming resistant, the doctors were like, yeah, we'll just do 6 months of consecutive UTI treatment. And me being a biomedical engineer, I was like, okay, this is a red flag. This is what we're not going to do. But that's where the frustration came in because I knew that someone like my mom, who is an immigrant from Syria, who would literally just trust her doctor, would go on this 6 months of antibiotic therapy and would likely worsen the situation. And so I was like, there has to be another solution. And that's what prompted me to do what every biomedical engineer does best, and that's research. I mean, we're scientists. And so I started researching, and that's where I started learning about the vaginal microbiome and why I kept getting all these UTIs, because all of the antibiotics I was on was actually killing my vaginal microbiome of its healthy and good bacteria, because antibiotics not only kill the bad bacteria causing the infection, but they also kill the good bacteria, which is why so many people, after taking antibiotics, they end up getting yeast infections. And so it's just so common. Then you deal with BV. So I've dealt with the whole thing after being on antibiotics, and not a single doctor told me to replenish my body with this good bacteria. And so I just fell down this rabbit hole, thank the Lord, and just kept doing research, and I found the world of probiotics, and there was just no gold standard probiotic for vaginal health. And I was like, let me be the change. So that's how With Meraki Co was born. But really, it was my lack of knowledge, which is why the huge part of my business and the backbone of it is education, awareness, and destigmatizing vaginal health as a whole, because that's how my journey really came about, was my lack of knowledge and was my lack of understanding and my unfortunate shame that I had in my vaginal health. Like, I was so worried to say that I was having burning down there because I didn't know how it would sound or what it would come. I was worried about that, even that little judgment, even going to the doctor and saying it is like scary, like,
Yeah.
so, and now I'm unapologetically loud and proud about vaginal health, because it's not something we should be ashamed about. The burning, the itchiness, all of that, like, it happens to the best of us. So but really that's this stigma around vaginal health and my lack of knowledge is what got me to where I am today, truly.
Yeah, that's so interesting because I really relate to the like lack of knowledge. I mean, I still feel like I don't have a lot of knowledge around it. And I feel like a lot of women don't. Like, I remember in high school when, my friends and I, started getting like yeast infections and UTIs. And I remember, I think my first yeast infection was from wearing just like nylon underwear, because at the time everyone like went to Victoria's Secret Pink and got those like nylon thongs. And I didn't understand that like something like that could like throw things off and cause like yeast and stuff like that. And I feel like that is something I still struggle with a lot, is like the yeast infection of it all. So it's really interesting to hear how like your experience like empowered you to get the information. And because of your scientific background, like, you were really able to do something with it. And something that I really want to know, because when you came to us and like it was like, oh, you're a biomedical engineer that studies the vaginal microbiome, I was like, what the heck even is the vaginal microbiome?
Oh,
Like, please tell us and give us that education, because I have no idea.
Yes. Oh my God. I love this. This is geek in me is screaming. I'm so excited. So the vaginal microbiome. So essentially in the vagina, what we have is basically a community. And in this community is the vaginal microbiome. So you have a gut microbiome. I'm sure you may have heard of it. Our skin has a microbiome. And in this microbiome contains good bacteria, bad bacteria, but bad bacteria is typically just like at bay if good bacteria is present. And so the community or the family of good bacteria that dominates every single healthy vagina is known as lactobacillus. So lactobacillus is this good bacteria that competes for adhesion to the walls of the vagina. And so when this bacteria sticks to these walls, it uses glycogen that is supplied from our estrogen. So in our bodies, we're producing the female hormone estrogen. And when we have normal and healthy amounts of estrogen, it is supplying glycogen, which is a polysaccharide, to the lactobacillus in our vaginas. And so this lactobacillus is using this energy supply to stay alive and produce lactic acid. So lactobacillus, not every single strain of lactobacillus produces lactic acid, but most do, the one that are found in our vaginas. So this lactic acid production is what generates an acidic pH in our vagina. So growing up, we've always heard of pH balance and we heard of your vagina is self-cleaning, but nobody has ever explained why. So your vagina is self-cleaning only when you have the presence of good bacteria. This is what gives your vagina that self-cleaning ability because your vagina will always come into contact with bad bacteria, whether that's through sex or whether that's through you accidentally even like washed with the wrong soap and it irritated your vagina. That healthy bacteria and that healthy community in your microbiome is there to protect you. And so it's self-cleaning. It'll say, you don't belong here. And this lactic acid production is what keeps your vagina at a healthy pH. So every vagina is supposed to be between a 3.8 and a 4.5. And so that's the acidic value that we need to be in. So a pH change directly means a shift in the vaginal microbiome. And this shift is when you lose good bacteria. So what a lot of people don't realize is bacterial vaginosis, which is one of the most, if not the most common vaginal infection. What people don't know is that bacterial vaginosis is actually the deficiency of lactobacillus. So if you do not have lactobacillus in your vagina, then what we see is bad bacteria, specifically the ones that are the reason that bacterial vaginosis even becomes a thing. So like we've heard of Gardnerella and there's other things that cause, like we have group B strep and we have other bacterias that grow. And so these bacterias grow in the absence of lactobacillus. And so now when you have bad bacteria growing, this bad bacteria has a high pH. And so your pH changes. And so when we talk about vaginal microbiome and throwing off your pH, all of it comes back to the microbiome and the bacterial balance. That's what the microbiome is. It's your balance of bacteria. And so things like using the wrong soap can actually kill off the lactobacillus. So there's been research studies showcasing that Vagisil has actually killed the good bacteria in the vagina. It's actually been clinically tested and it does have the ability to kill off lactobacillus. And so when lactobacillus dies, then all the bad bacteria that naturally, I mean, nobody is 100% made of good bacteria, right? We always have a little bit of yeast, a little bit of bacteria in our vaginas, bad bacteria, Gardnerella. But when this lactobacillus is missing and killed off, this is when the bad bacteria loves to thrive because you no longer have this acidic pH because bad bacteria and yeast love to grow in a higher pH value. So without the acidity, they start to grow and they start to flourish. And so that's directly what the vaginal microbiome is. But healthy bacteria, dominating healthy bacteria, is what gives the vagina this self-cleaning ability and the acidic pH that we've heard of but never really understood. Because a lot of people
Yeah.
just say, like, yeah, this is going to throw off your pH. I'm like, let's actually talk about what pH is because it's not just a number, because you can have a temporary pH adjustment, but you're not actually correcting your pH. So it's your vaginal microbiome is the root of all of these buzzwords that we hear on the internet.
Right. Yeah, 100%. Because I feel like, it's cool that you, or not cool, or just like informative that you bring up Vagisil, because I feel like something like another, I'm just like thinking really back to like high school with this
Yeah.
conversation, because I feel like that's, when you start learning things and, girls talk and we start
Yes.
comparing notes and everything. And I remember when everyone started like using like Summer's Eve, I
Yes.
think that's what it's called. And it was like, and then it was like in college, it was like, no, you can't use that because it like does this and that.
Right.
And it's like, you don't even really know what it means when it's like, oh, this is bad.
Right. And so, and for with things like, what's I think also frustrating is in my journey of like creating my company and then wanting to create products for vaginal health is recognizing the misinformation that exists in
Hmm.
the market because we see things, and I swear everything in the feminine health aisle is labeled pH balance. And I don't think people realize like a wash cannot balance your vaginal pH. The only thing that can balance the vaginal pH is lactobacillus because it is
Mm,
directly, consistently producing lactic acid. This production of lactic acid is what generates an acidic pH. So a wash isn't going to balance it. And in fact, the problem is when we're younger, like middle school, high school, we think like we've known about douching, and people
yeah.
have douched in the past. And so I was fortunate that my mom told me from a very young age, like, no, you don't douche. It's not good for you. But so many people do. And so many people think that like soaps and all these fancy things need to go in our vagina, not realizing that things like Vagisil do kill off this good bacteria that you do have in your vagina. And so when you lose this good bacteria in your vagina, you're left with bad bacteria growing. So now you're having itching and you're having burning. So you go back to the store and then you buy the Vagisil anti-itch cream, the Vagisil anti-itch wipes. And now you're just giving all your money to Vagisil, buying their whole line of products that's actually making the problem worse and never
Mm,
solving it. And these big companies are profiting off of a vulnerable topic. And so that's what was always so frustrating to me is like you are causing the problem and these vulnerable innocent women are just going right back to the store and they're like, oh my god, I'm having itching, and they buy the anti-itch cream. And I'm against these anti-itch. I've been asked like, will you ever come out with an anti-itch cream? I'm like, no, because if you are having itching, there's a root problem and it's an imbalance in your vaginal microbiome. We need to
mm,
correct it. I'm not going to give you like a hydrocortisone cream to just put on the itching. Like we need to find what the root cause of the itching is, and it's likely an imbalance in your microbiome. You're having a bacterial imbalance, and we need to fix it, correct it, and like restore and then maintain it. I always say my product is meant to restore and maintain. So if you're having an active infection, you definitely want to kill the infection with antibiotics, but you want to restore the vaginal microbiome with its good and healthy protective bacteria, and then keep taking the probiotic to maintain that healthy bacterial balance. And so there's still like I remember I went to CVS and there's Summer's Eve vinegar douche, and I'm like,
oh
what
my
am
God.
I doing? And I've seen TikToks where people are like, if you have a yeast infection, just do like 3 parts water, 1 part apple cider vinegar, and just spray it at your hoo-ha. Your yeast infection will be gone. And I'm like, guys, a temporary pH adjustment is not correcting your vaginal pH. Like,
Yeah.
so I think that's part of the misinformation is like we don't, or the average person doesn't fully understand what a vaginal pH is. We think
Yeah.
numbers and we think it's the same with boric acid. People think, oh, I'll pop a boric acid suppository in and that's it. And I'm like, you're going to be so dependent on these pH adjustments without actually restoring and maintaining your vaginal pH because you're not putting the good bacteria in your vagina because that's what your microbiome needs, not like a temporary pH change, you know? So,
Yeah. Yeah, and I maybe this is a silly question, but what causes like so the changes in the pH are caused by that lactic acid.
yes.
Okay. And what changes that number? Is it like food or like I don't know, lifestyle
Yeah.
that changes that?
Yeah, so the biggest thing that changes the shifts in our microbiome is hormones. The
Okay.
lovely thing that we all like to talk about. So people who are battling with PCOS, people who are battling with menopause, if you are in pre or post menopause and your hormones are shifting. And in fact, one of the biggest, which is ironically when I started having these issues, your period is a common trigger for these infections, and this is because, as you know, our hormones are on a about 30-day cycle, and so every single day our hormones are changing. And so it's ironic that my very first UTI was on my period, and this is because when you are on your period you are more susceptible to urinary tract infections, bacterial vaginosis, and yeast infections. Because if you remember in the beginning when I was talking about the science, I mentioned that estrogen produces glycogen, and glycogen is the energy source for the good bacteria. But right before our period, we have this very rapid dip in our estrogen. And so when your estrogen dips before your period, you lose the energy supply to this lactobacillus. So the lactobacillus does struggle to survive. And so naturally, before the period comes, we lose some of this good bacteria in our vaginas, which makes us more susceptible to UTIs, BV, and yeast infections, because BV will use this opportunity to quickly grow. And our period blood is alkaline, its pH is rather high. So for the 5, 6 days that you're bleeding, your vagina is really just surrounded in a higher pH while simultaneously losing some of this good bacteria. And so
Yeah.
this bad bacteria like Gardnerella may say, oh my God, this is my time to shine, and will try to grow and start to grow. And so this is why it's so important to consistently be taking a vaginal probiotic so that you're restoring and maintaining the good bacteria in your vagina all 30 days, every single day, because our hormones are such an important factor. Men have it so easy. They run on a 24-hour cycle, and we're over here
Literally.
with a 30-day cycle. Every day is different. And so
Interesting.
yeah, even people on birth control, that's another thing we see, like fluctuations in hormones. And this is why so many of my friends who are on birth control have yeast infections, and it's the shift of their hormones, and that also causes yeast infections. And sometimes the birth control can have too high of estrogen, and when your estrogen is too high, that typically triggers yeast infections. And so if you have too little estrogen, you're more susceptible to BV and UTIs and yeast infections. So your hormones, stress is another thing. So the stress hormone is cortisol. When you have really high cortisol, your vaginal microbiome struggles to maintain its healthy bacteria. Our immune system is another thing if you have a weakened immune system. So if you're ever sick, so ironically, I just got hit with all the stones when I got my first UTI because I was having a cold, I was on my period. So it was a combination of my weakened immune system, my hormones shifting, and then I had my UTI, and then I was on antibiotics. So now I'm left at the most vulnerable state.
Yeah.
So yeah, it's literally just day-to-day things, unlike what I think we've all been told growing up. People think that you're dirty if you get BV, UTIs, or
Hmm.
yeast infections. People think that you have multiple sexual partners, or that it's all from sex. And there was always this narrative that UTIs come from sex, and it's like,
Yeah.
no, that is not true. It is not true. And so people just don't understand it. And it's like, just being a woman and having estrogen is like the factor that causes us to have these infections. And so it's not these narratives. I've When I made my TikToks doing education, I've had people comment like, just take a shower, you guys are so dirty. And it's like, okay, sure, because a shower is going to solve the problem. Like,
Exactly. I'm like, what? It's interesting because I feel like I'm learning from this conversation. Like, like how could a wash help the situation? Because it's like it's inside of you, and a watch is watching the outside. And yeah, I think that was one of my like top questions for you was like, this idea of UTIs being connected to sex, and specifically this like thing that I feel like I've just like somehow known all my life of like you have to pee after you have sex. Like, is that like a myth? What is it with that statement?
So literally all sex does is introduce bacteria inside of the vaginal microbiome.
Yeah.
But E. coli, which is the main pathogen that causes urinary tract infections, E. coli isn't passed from a male partner to a female partner. That's just not how it works. So how E. coli is introduced in the vagina, our vagina is very close to our rectum. And so that is why we are so susceptible to urinary tract infections, and the urethra in the vagina is shorter than what it is in a male. And so, if our vagina comes in contact with uropathogenic E. coli from our rectum, because our rectal mucosa ascends to our vaginal mucosa, which is, I will talk in a little bit why gut health is so important, because your gut
Interesting.
health is tied to your vaginal health because the microbiomes are very similar. And so a
Okay.
lot of times I recommend my customers, if you're having gut issues and you're seeing all of these UTIs and yeast infections, you should maybe start looking at your gut health. And probiotics are incredible for gut health because you're balancing both. You really are. And so E. coli comes from the gut. Now, when you're having sex, it can get messy, and this mucosa that you can't feel, it's not like your gut is leaking and you're just having poop everywhere. This invisible mucosa that you can't see because it's on a micro scale, it ascends to the vagina, and the act of penetration can push some of this into the vagina. But when you have the presence of this healthy bacteria, this pathogenic bacteria isn't able to grow. And so sex can, of course, make you vulnerable in the sense that it's introducing your vagina to bacteria. But when you are consistently restoring and maintaining it with the healthy bacteria, the healthy guys are going to do their job. Like, the healthy bacteria is going to do its job to protect you. That's what it's there for. And so, sure, it's great to flush your bladder after sex, but it's not the like absolute must. If you don't, it shouldn't be a thing that causes you to have a urinary tract infection, because E. coli isn't being shoved in your urethra during sex. So I think
Right.
it's more so doctors just coming up with, oh, like, you should do this or you should do that. And it's like, guys, no, like, it's healthy to flush your bladder, but it shouldn't be the like gold standard method of prevention, because what's really there to protect you is the lactobacillus, and we should prioritize that. um but if you do struggle with things like, so I think one of the problems after having repeated urinary tract infections is sometimes we start to have pelvic floor dysfunction and we disrupt the signal. So I know for me, I most definitely have, even till this day, some pelvic floor dysfunction because I don't fully empty out my bladder. And so when women do experience multiple urinary tract infections, it does cause some damage between the bladder and mind connection and the signal that's being sent, because of your body going into protective mode so much
Sure.
that it strains your pelvic floor. And so you have this dysfunction that it might not know when to fully empty, and it might be tightened all the time that you're not fully emptying your bladder. And so in that case, women can be more susceptible to, with like, holding that bad bacteria in their bladder for too long, which can trigger a UTI. But it's not directly the act of sex, it's the issue of having the repeated urinary tract infections that is causing pelvic floor dysfunction, which can make you more susceptible to getting another UTI. So unfortunately, UTIs trigger pelvic floor dysfunction, which can trigger more UTIs, and you're in this endless cycle. And it's the same with antibiotics. You take antibiotics and now you're left with no good bacteria. So then your vagina comes into contact with bad bacteria through anything. It could even be like being on a period and wearing your pad for too long, and now you're harboring moisture, and the yeast is like, I'm going to grow and I'm going to flourish and survive. And so now you have a yeast infection. You're on antifungals, but now BV comes up, and you're in this endless cycle without having good bacteria.
Yeah, I think it's so interesting the connection that you talked about between the gut and the vaginal microbiome, because I'm like, oh my God, is it because I have terrible, like I have really bad IBS, like I have terrible gut issues, and and they've been worse the last couple months, and like so has like things with my vagina, and now I'm like, oh wait, like and now I really do want to hear about your product and the probiotic of it all, and how it works to heal all this and restore and maintain, like you've been saying, because I feel like that is such like a important piece of knowledge for
Mhm.
everybody to walk away from. Like I'm like, I need to order this right after we're done. Like I'm ready
Yes.
to restore and maintain.
Yes. So
Yeah.
when I was really struggling with urinary tract infections, I just thought like, okay, I need to flush my bladder and things like that. But after I started taking probiotics and everything, something else that I started to learn was how, having things like IBS is
Hmm.
directly related to having more occurrences of yeast infections and BV and things like that. And so I started studying the gut microbiome, and this
Yeah.
is where I learned, because the vaginal microbiome and the rectal mucosa are just so similar, this is where we've been seeing the importance of restoring your gut microbiome in order to restore your vaginal microbiome. And so all probiotics are good for gut health, but not all probiotics are good for the vagina, because, or are beneficial to the vagina. And that's because only a certain kind of bacteria produces lactic acid, and that's the lactobacillus that we talked about. But one of the biggest things that people don't realize with IBS is typically caused by high cortisol. And so cortisol is your stress hormone. And when you have high cortisol levels, you actually are more susceptible to this irritable bowel syndrome. And this irritable bowel syndrome can sometimes cause a leaky gut. And when you have a leaky gut, what it does is it shifts the microbiome in your gut. It causes this good bacteria to actually struggle to survive. And so pathogenic bacteria starts to grow, and you have this imbalance, this dysbiosis within your gut, in your intestines, and it causes all of these symptoms, the leaky gut, having to go to the bathroom, and all these things. And so we need to put an emphasis on restoring the gut microbiome with probiotics, but you also want to focus on balancing your cortisol levels. And so this is something that I learned, because now we're seeing stress effects killing off the good bacteria in your gut, but also in your vagina. And so we can keep pushing probiotics in our system, right? But if we're not balancing that cortisol, then we're going to keep having this issue. And so balancing the cortisol while simultaneously replenishing our microbiome with the good bacteria is so important, which is why I've been working on developing a new product that I'm actually launching in about a month that does just
Exciting.
that. Yes.
Yeah.
So with
Tell us about it. Because
yes.
I feel like, sorry to interrupt you,
No.
cortisol is another like buzzword that you hear
Yes.
all the time. And my endocrinologist, and now I'm seeing her next week. I'm like, I am going to do that cortisol test.
Yes.
I wouldn't be surprised if I had high cortisol. But yeah, I think it's a buzzword, and you're like, all right, what is it? How do I, lower it or maintain it? So please tell us about your product and just like how to, you know, lower and maintain the cortisol.
Yeah. So my current product is the most incredible probiotic prebiotic blend. So it's 50 billion colony forming units. So that's the amount of good bacteria. And so we see things on the market like 1 billion CFU, 10 billion CFUs. Mine has 50 billion CFUs. They're also protected with this thing called bio enhanced acid resistant strains. So they're meant to withstand the stomach's acidity. So my biggest advice is, for anyone looking for a probiotic, do not buy a gummy probiotic. They don't work. They're not going to make it to your gut because they can't survive the stomach's acidity. So before things, I think when we think of gut, we just think of stomach, and it's not your stomach at all. It's actually your intestines. Your gut is your intestines, your colon. It is not your stomach. Your stomach has its acidity. It's the first entry to the gut. And so the probiotics have to survive the stomach's acidity because our stomachs are highly, highly acidic. So they need to survive the stomach's acidity to then make it to the colon, make it to the intestines, and then make it to the vagina. So if they don't make it through the gut or through the stomach, they're not going to make it to the gut. So we wanted to make sure that we are giving you our product is in a capsule form, but we want to make sure that we're giving you a high amount to ensure that it makes it to your gut and to ensure it makes it to the vagina, while also protecting these strains with a technology that's meant to withstand the stomach's acidity. We're also feeding these probiotics throughout its little travel to your vagina through all the intestines. Its travel is being fed through prebiotic fibers. So prebiotic fibers, because it's a fiber, sometimes can cause gas and bloating in women. So we chose ones that were clinically studied and clinically shown to reduce gas and bloating so that you're not left with these uncomfortable symptoms that probiotics on the market unfortunately cause, because they use like potato starch and these fibers that cause gas and bloating. And so we wanted to use fibers that reduce that so that you can take this and have a happy gut and you're not having these uncomfortable symptoms. And then our stars of supporting the urinary tract is cranberry, but not just any cranberry extract. This is a patented formula. So we hear again, you have a UTI, they're like, oh, drink cranberry juice. Cranberry in specific, so cranberries and blueberries and a bunch of other things have these things called proanthocyanidins, but the ones that exist in cranberries, they have a double bonded molecular structure that is meant to attach to the epithelial cells within the vagina, and it prevents uropathogenic E. coli from attaching and causing a UTI. And so this is only found in cranberries, but cranberry juice, 9 times out of 10, does not contain the proanthocyanidins that you need. So that's why we are getting it from the extract, but the extract that we use has the clinically studied 36 milligrams of proanthocyanidins that has been clinically proven to prevent uropathogenic E. coli from causing a UTI. So we have that cranberry in there, this patented formula that is meant to protect you from E. coli. And then there's vitamin D3, which has been shown in research to help support a healthy urinary tract. So those are like the start of helping to support the urinary tract, the bladder, the kidney, with also simultaneously restoring and maintaining the vaginal microbiome. So you get this like full coverage. Now, in our new product, we believe in this cult favorite of our probiotic formula. So our 50 billion CFU and its prebiotic fibers, they are still there. It is that same formula. But now we have, rather than the cranberry and the vitamin D, we have swapped those for some herbs that have been clinically shown to balance cortisol. And so cortisol, as I mentioned, is your stress hormone. And this we see, like, I believe like with IBS, people are typically like, oh, watch what you eat. Hot stuff causes this. And you can, if you eat like things that are spicy, you have to have a low FODMAP and stuff like that. And there's just a bunch of things with IBS. So what we want to do is we want to help balance the stress hormone, and we want to balance estrogen, progesterone. We want to balance hormones as a whole. So things like ashwagandha, L-theanine, these things have been clinically shown to actually balance cortisol and balance estrogen. And so by balancing these hormones, you are left with less fluctuation that's taking place in your body. And so you're maintaining the stability within your hormones while also restoring and maintaining your microbiome, your gut and vaginal microbiome, with the bacteria that it needs, so that you can be happy and healthy and free from all of these infections.
That's amazing. I feel like I'm learning so much. Like all the things are like clicking in my head as you're speaking. I'm like, OMG.
Right.
And, and I think, again, like I feel like on TikTok, on social media, you hear so many people talking about hormones and all these things. And as a lay person who, doesn't study all of this stuff, you're just like,
Right.
what does it even mean? Like, I'd love to know what it means. So I think this is so informative because, it's crazy to hear how much our
Yes.
hormones really do affect our body in such a, unique and interesting way.
Yes.
And like, what causes people to have higher cholesterol? You know, you hear stress, and I'm thinking like
Mhm.
day to day stress, work stress. Like, is that the stress that is causing the higher cortisol? Or
It
is
can.
it like, okay,
Yes, no, it can. And also, we see things like a dip in estrogen can trigger a rise in cortisol. And so, when your
okay.
estrogen dips, your body almost reacts like, oh my God, my female hormone is really low. And so, there is a link to people with PCOS or people who are going through menopause who start to see this rise in cortisol. So, low estrogen has been attributed to a spike and a rise in cortisol. And so this is because our body is trying to protect us. I think what we need to always remember is our body is here and functions to protect us. And so when something shifts and something changes, our body's like, oh my God, we need to go into protective mode. And so the cortisol spikes to try to protect us. So cortisol rises right before our period because our estrogen dips. But when we have consistent imbalances in our female hormones, we can see consistent rises in cortisol because it is almost trying to make up for this because it senses that something is off. But things like day-to-day work life stress, lack of sleep, so when you're not sleeping a lot, all of the depletion of your body saying, I didn't get my rest for tonight, your cortisol rises. So you can wake up in the morning with high cortisol because the body is like, hold on, I don't feel right. So it's almost in this like protective mode. So this hormone really functions. Your stress hormone is a response. It really is a response. I think that's what's really important to learn when it comes to cortisol is cortisol functions as like a response to stressors that exist in the life and in your life. And a stressor is the depletion of the female hormone. And it's like, oh my God, this is a stressor. And then boom, cortisol just suddenly out of nowhere skyrockets. And so cortisol is consistently high during women going through menopause because their hormones are dipping. And so the cortisol is rising because it senses a stressor, it senses something is off. And so areas of inflammation in your body. So when you're getting these hot flashes and the shifts in your mood and stuff like that, this is all triggering a stress response to your body. And so your cortisol rises in unfortunately a way to, oh my God, it's trying to protect you, but it needs to be balanced. But sometimes it just doesn't know because other things are throwing it off.
Yeah, it's so interesting how, like, I think, you know, what you're speaking about reminds me of, like,
Mhm.
you know, anxiety and how, like, you know, when we are, you know, mentally struggling, it's usually because, you know, our mind is trying to protect us in some way. And I feel like we talk a lot about mental health on the podcast, as Audrey and I have our like own struggles with mental health. But it's so interesting how, you know, things that can like seemingly be very bad
Yes.
to us, or these like, oh my
Yes.
gosh,
Yes.
our body's just trying to respond and, you know,
Mhm.
and protect us. So I think this is really great information. And something I've also been interested in asking you is like, I do think there's so many misconceptions and myths around like the vagina and everything. What are your like top two, like this is a myth and misconception when it comes to vaginal health and just the vagina in general?
Yeah. So my number one always, as I mentioned before, these infections do not just come from sex. It's more than that. It literally anything can throw. And so even I'm so happy that you brought up anxiety. So even within the last year of like running my business and it's been so much, I've had heightened anxiety levels. And
Yeah.
so heightened anxiety elevates stress and that stress hormone, cortisol. And so there is a direct link to anxiety and having gut imbalances and vaginal microbiome imbalances. And so things like that can cause a yeast infection or a UTI or BV. And so it's not always sex related. I tell everybody that I'm so sick and tired of people just attributing urinary and vaginal infections to sex because that it's just not true. It's simply not true. And so that is like my number one. I say that for absolutely everyone. My number two would likely be, again, what we talked about, the vagina is only self-cleaning if you have the presence of good bacteria, because I think like it's a buzzword that we've talked about, and it's not something that people should use just to throw, oh, your vagina is self-cleaning. And no, like that's not how it works. You need the presence of good bacteria for your vagina to have the ability to be self-cleaning. And number 3, I always love to bring this up, boric acid is not the solution. I am so against boric acid.
Can I ask? I don't even know what boric acid is. What is boric acid?
Good. I'm so glad. So boric acid is something that is made in a suppository. So it's made in a capsule that you essentially put up your vagina and it'll melt. And this boric acid has been used for a while to treat bacterial vaginosis and yeast infections. And so what's happening, unfortunately, is these companies are giving like 30-day supplies. They'll have like a bottle of these boric acid capsules, and you have them, and there are women who are putting boric acid in their vaginas every single night. So boric acid has for centuries been used as a roach killer because it's incredibly strong, incredibly strong. And so I think the misconception that people have with boric acid is that they hear the word acid and they think, oh my God, this is going to make my vagina acidic and this is going to solve the problem, because they think I'm having BV, my pH must be high, so I'm going to fix my pH by bringing it back down with boric acid. But again, they don't realize that the number doesn't matter. It's about the bacteria. So what boric acid does is it's an antiseptic. So it does kill Gardnerella. It can kill the fungus that's causing yeast infections, but it doesn't discriminate against good and bad bacteria. It's similar to antibiotics. It will kill off the lactobacillus as well. Now, it may take a little bit longer to kill off the lactobacillus because it is still an acid, and lactobacillus does like to thrive in an acidic environment. So it does, for the most case, target the biofilm of this bad bacteria first. But with consistent use, especially because we sometimes recommend 7 to 10 nights of using boric acid consistently, it's targeting this bacteria. And so the lactobacillus starts to struggle and it dies because it is an antiseptic. And so it also, because it is so strong, it thins and it also like dries out the vagina. So when your vagina is dry and those walls are thinner, you become more susceptible to urinary and vaginal infections because these pathogens love to grow in a dry, thinned, weakened environment. And so boric acid, its a molecular pH is around a 5.5, which if you remember from earlier, I said a healthy vagina is between a 3.8 and a 4.5. So having this like higher than what is healthy pH level makes lactobacillus struggle a bit to survive. And so you are not fixing the problem by taking boric acid. What I tell all of my customers who reach out for advice, I always tell them if metronidazole, so the antibiotic, or clindamycin that's used to treat bacterial vaginosis, if those are no longer working because maybe you're resistant, or if you have a stubborn as hell yeast infection, my advice is if pharmaceutical drugs are not getting rid of it and you're looking for a homeopathic solution, my advice is yes, use boric acid for 7 to 10 nights because it is strong. It can and will kill off this bacteria. But if you use boric acid, you must use a probiotic after. There's no ifs, ands, or buts from me. Like, you have to, because if you don't, you are wiping your vagina clean of all of its good, healthy bacteria. And so you are leaving yourself in a vulnerable state to keep getting reinfections, which is why you see on TikTok, women will say, oh my God, anytime I feel something's off, I just pop this in and I feel better. And then anytime I feel off, and I'm like, my love, you keep feeling off because you are not restoring and maintaining your vaginal microbiome with good bacteria. You're not solving the problem. You are just putting like a Band-Aid. That's it. Like, imagine you have an open wound and you don't go and get stitches and you just like are like, applying pressure, doing the like preliminary things, but not like solving the issue. And so I'm like, no, you don't just pop a boric acid suppository in anytime that you are feeling off. If you are feeling off, yes, it's probably because bad bacteria or yeast is growing, and we can kill it with boric acid. But now you want to bring those healthy guys back in. You want to bring the lactobacillus back in so that now it can restore the environment and then keep using probiotics to protect you.
Yeah, that's so interesting. I had never heard of this before. But it seems like a very interesting like cycle that you can get yourself into if you just keep like using it, and then like kind of like you said, you're killing off all this good bacteria, and then you like need it all over again.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah. It's really interesting the whole idea of like good bacteria, bad bacteria. And I'm curious because I think another like very taboo topic is like vaginal odor and like, girls struggling with that. Again, like I remember, being in high school and people are like, how do you get your vagina to smell good? Like, do you drink pineapple juice? Like I've heard that and
Yeah.
all of that stuff. So is the vaginal odor coming from like those like imbalances in the good and the bad bacteria, and how do you suggest you treat it?
Yeah, so odor is directly attributed to the balance of the bacteria in your vagina. And so when you have, I used to work in a microbiology lab during my time at Lehigh University when I was studying biomedical engineering. And all different, as the medical texts would teach me and tell me, is bacteria, they would know what's growing when they plated the patient's sample based on like how it smelled. Some of them would have a certain smell that you would know, like, okay, this is staph growing, this is streptococcus growing. So you kind of like know what bacteria produces an odor. It's normal, it produces an odor. And so a lot of times that is not really understood, that even good bacteria has a bit of odor. It's bacteria. And so this odor does not smell like flowers and roses and peaches, but it also doesn't smell foul. So good bacteria does not smell foul. It shouldn't smell foul. It is acidic. So sometimes you can have more of a like vinegary type of smell, or even like a like, I don't want to say yeasty because people are going to think yeast infection, but it can have more of a like a tangy smell.
Sure.
It's and again, those things are normal. Now, when we start to see foul odors, so Gardnerella in particular is well known to produce a fishy odor. This fishy odor is why everyone says BV, BV, BV. But there's other bacterias that can grow during BV that don't exactly cause a fishy odor, but can cause a rotten odor, a foul odor that is maybe different than what you are used to. And so the way to correct that is, of course, targeting the bad bacteria that's causing this foul odor. And so I always say, do not use like home remedies. I've seen people putting tampons in plain Greek yogurt and shoving it up their vaginas. And I'm like, guys, I also want to note that over 70% of vaginal infections are misdiagnosed, are self-misdiagnosed. And
Mm.
so we as a whole need to stop diagnosing ourselves, because I think we are so paranoid about smell and odor and discharge. We get so paranoid. Like, let me be the first to tell you, if ladies, you're listening to this, if you have a little bit of yellow discharge, it doesn't always mean that you're having an infection. Your vagina is always shifting and changing because we run on a 30-day hormonal cycle. And so just because sometimes your discharge can have a yellowish undertone because of your urine. So there's no need to panic every single time you see any discoloration in your discharge, or if your discharge is white. I promise you, it does not always mean that you have a yeast infection. Sometimes this frothy white discharge can indicate bacterial vaginosis, but you are trying to treat it like a yeast infection when it's not. So this is why I'm also against these websites that allow you to like go online and like take a quiz, and then they'll send a prescription
Oh.
to your pharmacy for BV or yeast infections, unless you're someone with like recurrent infections. Like for me, I know when I'm having a UTI. There's no getting past it. I've had so many in my life. I know exactly what a UTI is. But sometimes people will have burning while peeing, and it could be caused by bacterial vaginosis, but we think, oh, there's burning while peeing. So we just assume, oh, UTI. And then now we're taking antibiotics for an infection that's not even present. And that's how you develop antibiotic resistance.
Mm,
So please, I fully understand, anxiety heightens when we have any kind of odor, any kind of discolored discharge, and we freak out. It's normal. I still do. If I have a long day of forgetting to drink water and I'm slightly dehydrated and I go to sit on a toilet and I feel like my urine is burning because I'm so dehydrated, I
hmm.
panic. It is so normal. Like even me, I panic and I go into like oh my God, am I having a UTI? But we need to take a second to just breathe and kind of just trust our bodies and not start reaching in our medicine cabinets or running to the pharmacy, because even we'll go and get monostat for a yeast infection. And it's like, you might not even have a yeast infection. It might be BV that you think is a yeast infection, or maybe it's because you're about to get your period. Because when you get right before your period, your estrogen drops. Because of this dip in estrogen, your vagina gets a little more dry, and this dryness can cause itchiness and a bit of like burning. So even
Yeah.
I'm about to get my period, I feel dryness in my vagina currently, and that is normal. It does not mean an infection is present. And so I understand the anxiety, and I think it's because we are in this constant mode of trying to be perfect with our vaginal health, and it is okay. Like your vagina is doing its best, and I think it's just so important to try to listen and be in tune with your vagina and like kind of understand. And a part of it is really just starting to understand the vaginal microbiome and understand what your vagina does and
Yeah.
its functions and everything, because that's what's so important to having this relationship with your vagina and being able to know what's going on. Because with all the misinformation that exists on the internet and in the world and in the medical spaces, we are the number one culprits of misdiagnosing ourselves, along with then our doctors misdiagnosing ourselves. So like over half of the antibiotics that are prescribed for urinary and vaginal infections are misdiagnosed in this country, and so that causes antibiotic resistance and us trying to diagnose ourselves and thinking we know, oh, white discharge must mean yeast infection. It's just not true. And so a foul odor does represent something being wrong, but my advice is go get a culture done. Request a culture from your doctor, not just oh, let me put a speculum in and just look at things. No.
Yeah.
Request a vaginal culture. A vaginal culture is where they will swab you and they will plate it in a lab, and they put these plates in an incubator, and the bacteria that's in your vagina, whether it's good or bad, will start growing in these plates. A medical tech will read these plates after 48 hours, and they will be able to identify what species is growing and causing your symptoms, your odor, your itching, your burning. So my biggest advice is don't at home diagnose, go to your doctor and demand, be your biggest advocate. I had to tell my doctors, run an antibiotic susceptibility test so that I could prove to them that I was resistant to cephalexin. I had to say, run a culture. And they looked at me, they're like, you know what a culture is? I'm like, of course I do, because I'm a biomedical engineer. But again, the average person wouldn't know what to demand and what to request. So it's frustrating that me being a biomedical engineer, I have this knowledge. But my advice is, if I could pass that on to the average woman, be your own advocate. Demand for a culture. Even when you're having a UTI, don't let them just scan your urine and see, okay, you have nitrites. That means you have a UTI. Having white blood cells in your urine doesn't automatically mean you have a UTI. These urine strips that you can find at CVS that test for leukocytes and nitrites, it doesn't always mean you have a UTI. That's not true. Like people think, oh my God, I have white blood cells in my urine. This must mean that I have an infection. No, sometimes it could just be your bladder is inflamed because of all the previous UTIs that you had. Or maybe something is causing inflammation. Maybe you held your bladder, your urine in for too long, that the wall in your bladder became become irritated. And so your body is inflamed, the walls are inflamed. So that triggers white blood cells to be in your urine because it's trying to protect you because you made the mistake of holding in your urine. And so your bladder got irritated and now there's white blood cells there to protect you. Doesn't mean you have a UTI. So I just, self diagnosing is never my right, unless you're someone who's like, I've had yeast infections my whole life. I know what a yeast infection is.
Yeah.
I totally recommend being your biggest advocate, going to the doctor, demanding cultures for your urine, for your vaginal swabs, so that we could get to the root cause of your infection and then treat you properly. And if your doctor doesn't tell you, I'm here to tell you that the way that you will restore your vaginal microbiome and protect yourself is through probiotic supplementation.
Yeah, I mean, that's what I recently did. I went and I got a culture because I went and I picked up Monistat. I was like, oh, I must be having like a yeast infection. And then, I started having the burning peeing. I was like, I bet I have a UTI. And I called the doctor and she was like, you should come in and get a culture done and like, let's figure it out. And I went in and I didn't have a yeast infection, nor did I have BV. And so the first thing she said to me was, hey, like, you should take a probiotic, and I feel like that'll help your situation. So that's what I'm going to be doing after this, is ordering your probiotic.
Oh,
And before we have you plug all this information of where you can get your product, I want to ask you our last question. We ask everybody this question: is can you tell us a recent time where you felt clueless?
oh, the recent time where I felt clueless. Honestly, the new product development has been a journey, I think when the brand, I'm like, I want to expand. I felt very clueless at first of what do I want to expand with?
Hmm.
That's very important because for me, I know I didn't mention, but my company's name is With Meraki Co. And Meraki is a Greek word that means to do something with love, soul, and creativity. And so that's what my brand represents. It also means to leave a piece of yourself in your work. And so I battled urinary tract infections. I battled the whole 9 yards and created a product with love, soul, and creativity. And I am my own customer. I take my own probiotics faithfully every single day. I believe in it. I stand by it. And I want to keep that throughout every product that I launch. I want it to be something that I believe in, something that I stand by. And so I felt for a little bit clueless because I'm like, I celebrated my 1 year anniversary last year in August. I'm approaching this August will be my 2 year anniversary. And I'm like, it's time. Like, I want to launch a new product, but I felt a little clueless as to what will that be? And I started battling my own, seeing like, I feel like I'm having some inflammation or imbalance with all of the stress that I'm having, and me getting in a lab yet again and researching the stress hormone and researching the fluctuations of hormones and finding a love for hormones and the connection between them and the vaginal microbiome, and saying, well, our probiotic formula is like gold standard. And now that I'm no longer battling urinary tract infections, but I'm seeing this imbalance in my hormones, I want to balance my hormones. And so then being able to formulate something that's meant to balance the hormones while restoring and maintaining with our tried and true probiotic formula is something that I fell in love with. And I'm like, this is yet again leaving a piece of myself in my work. And so I think I felt very clueless as to, and you get those questions from people like, when are you launching a new product? It's been a year and a half. And I'm like, I feel clueless because I don't know what that, like, I don't just want to say, oh, okay, I'll go with my manufacturer and I'll just say, let's do a multivitamin just for like the hell of it. Because I don't want
Sure.
to just be another supplements company. I don't want to be just another one that you find off the shelf. Like, there's a story behind With Meraki Co. There's a real passion and a real love for my customers. Like, I adore my customers so, so much. Like, they are, I'll cry. But they're just so important to me. And I think my business and what it stands for is just so important to me. And I want to keep that throughout everything that comes from me and what I produce and what I say, like, this is mine, this is my baby. And I want to be able to believe in it. And so I felt clueless trying to decide what is that next product. But I was positioned in the right place at the right time where I started dealing with my own, like, well, I feel off. I feel like my hormones are off. And then going down this rabbit hole and learning about the hormones and studying that and the vaginal microbiome and its connection between the two, and saying, oh my God, this is what we need in the industry, because this is directly shifting our vaginal microbiome. But, we could keep putting all these probiotics in our body, but we should be able to balance these hormones as well. And so,
Hmm.
I've been able to then dissect that information. And now I'm so excited for the launch of my new product. I don't have an exact date yet, but I should have a date relatively shortly. But yeah, just clueless on I mean, I feel like in most parts, I'm a scientist who is still, after almost 2 years, learning how to be an entrepreneur. So
Sure.
I feel clueless every other week, if not
Yeah.
every week. So
Yeah.
it happens. You don't know everything. I feel like a lot of people always think like, oh, like every business person just like knows. And a lot of people, they're like, wow, you're 25, you're running this business, you're doing so well. I'm like, oh my God, like there's days where I don't even know. I'm like, what am I doing? And I have to make executive decisions that are hard. And sometimes I don't know if I'm making the right decisions. And I feel clueless as to what's the next step. Like, it's normal in the business owner life. And I'm sure you can relate to that too.
Yeah, no, I feel like there's always clueless moments. I mean, I was literally having this conversation with another creator yesterday, like, being like, yeah, everything can, look really nice and peachy and wrapped in a bow on the outside, but like on the
Right.
inside, behind the closed door, it can be a lot. And I think it's really beautiful to hear your story and to hear how much like passion you do put into your products because, like you said, like the supplement industry is so crazy now. And, you see a new product, a new thing all the time. And like, it's funny because I feel like my partner, like they can sometimes get wrapped up. Like the other day, they were like, does collagen actually work? And like stuff like that. And
Right.
so I think it's, for me, like, doing this interview with you, and I hopefully what the audience will feel too is like you feel the trust with somebody who has put this time and effort and care and thought into making a product. And it's not just like a dime a dozen sort of a thing.
Right. And that's exactly what my TikTok is for and why I'm so passionate about using that platform to really educate people, because I am at my core a scientist and a biomedical engineer. And when I explain the science to you, the products and why I'm formulating these products is because I have a deep, in depth knowledge of the vaginal microbiome. And so a lot of these bigger companies just don't. And it is about making money. And for me, it's not, it's really the education. I said it earlier, the education is the backbone to my brand, because it's so important that rather than just saying, here's a product, take this product, I really want people to, and even if the result of my TikTok video isn't somebody buying my product, at least they leave my TikTok understanding their reproductive health better. And that is just so important to me, because we all should have this deep understanding that traditional medicine they don't teach us this. Our healthcare system doesn't teach us this. Our schools don't teach us this. I mean, even when I was in school, we had sex ed and stuff like that, but they didn't teach us this in depthly about the vaginal microbiome. Like, nobody was telling us that lubricants and spermicides can throw off our vaginal microbiome. Nobody was telling us that a period can cause these infections. You just heard yeast infection or UTI, and that's what kind of triggers the stigmas around them. And so I'm just very fortunate that I can be able to push the education, because that's so important. It is just so, so important. I just want to change how we see and talk about vaginal health, which is why I'm so, so happy I was able to like talk to you
Yes.
so openly about it.
Yeah, no, this has been like such an amazing conversation. And I'm so excited for everyone to listen. And so, speaking of your TikTok, can you tell us where people can follow you, where they can get your product, all that stuff?
Yes. So my TikTok is Gianna MJ. So GIANA MJ. And then my website is www.shopwithmerakico.com. If you don't want to purchase my product, you can join the email list. Our emails are super exciting. We always are pushing educational content on there. I do everything from touching on women's health throughout the years and how it's been stigmatized and how we've been neglected in the medical system for all these years, the improvements that we've made. I talk about everything BV, UTIs, yeast infections, STIs, pelvic floor dysfunction. So I really push the educational information on my email list. It's literally free to join. So even if you're not ready to purchase my product yet, and you're not there financially or whatever your case is, you just don't want to, I encourage you to at least join the email list so that you can understand your vaginal health better. And then I have my Instagram page. It is at with Meraki Co. My personal page is just Gianna Jarrah, my first and last name. But yeah, I do like all the education everywhere. But my website, my TikTok are my main sources of content.
Amazing. Well, thank you so much for being here today, Gianna. I feel like everybody's going to hopefully take so much away. I know I did. And I am like running off with all this information now, being like, I got to tell everybody. And you guys know that you can follow us on TikTok at completely FCKING Clueless and on Instagram and YouTube at completely fucking clueless. Thank you guys for listening. Have an amazing Tuesday. Have an amazing week. And don't forget to be motherfucking clueless. Bye, everyone.
This has been a 58 Ember production. For more shows, please visit the 58 Ember channel, 58ember.com, or find us at 58 Ember Media on socials.